Joining us tonight. Oh, thank you, Dr. Eyler, for recording this. My name is Mario Giuliani, City of Benicia Economic Development Manager. I want to thank everyone, looks like 36 participants so far, for joining us tonight for our lecture with Dr. Robert Eyler. I want to extend our appreciation to city staff. I know our city manager, Lori Tinfo, is participating, as well as members of our city council. Also want to acknowledge the folks at Chabon Concepts. They are part of the City of Benicia's economic development team. And they're very helpful in putting together the information that we have been providing the city with our business resources. And I also want to acknowledge my colleague, Terry Davna. Tonight really is an opportunity for us to zero in on the economic impact that COVID-19 has had, in particular to our region and the City of Benicia. We've heard a lot of information over the past 6 weeks on a national level and a state level, but we wanted to provide an opportunity to our community to get some certainty and some clarity on how this is impacting our town. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Robert Eyler, who is a renowned economist, and he's in our own backyard as a professor at Sonoma State University and has for many years given economic reports on our region as well as other regions in California. So we're very lucky to have him, and I imagine, Dr. Eyler, after our session in Benicia, you will be sought after in other communities in Solano County, much like you have been throughout the state. So for everyone, this will be about a 25, 30-minute presentation by Dr. Eyler. This presentation and webinar is being recorded, and for those that have registered, you'll be receiving an email when the recording is up, which should occur in a couple of days on beniciabusiness.com. And with that, Dr. Eyler, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Mario. You can hear me okay, and you can see my top slide?
I can, and actually, before I turn it over, I do want to make a note for all of our Zoom participants. We will be taking a few questions at the end of this webinar, and so to ask a question, please use the chat feature on the bottom taskbar of Zoom. Note your questions. I will try to tally up those questions and then ask them at the end of the presentation. Now I think we're ready to go.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mario. I appreciate that. So folks, here's where we are. And so the basic agenda tonight is going to be to take you from the macro piece, sort of the national and state side, down to Benicia. This all started on March 1st. And you can see that break right here where we started the process in terms of seeing the number of cases rise in an increasing fashion. And then because we sheltered in place during the month of March, we've seen those cases start to increase at a decreasing rate. And so everybody has said on the health side that this is exactly what we wanted to do. The problem from an economic standpoint is that by sheltering in place and basically putting our state and national economy on hibernation, we're all starting to feel some of the impacts of that in our lives, at our businesses, and with our governments. This is what's been happening about the 7 or 8 days before last weekend, to just give you a sense of that flattening. Initially in March, what happened when we saw the cases rise is we saw our equity markets wobble. So from an investment standpoint, we had a pretty tough month in March. You can see that quick decline last month. So the shaded area shows you about the last 12 or 16 months, but it's really the far right-hand side of that shaded area that's important. You see the deep dive in March, which is the vertical line going down, and then there's a little bit of a V-shape coming back up, which is basically April so far. The cool thing about what happened in March in terms of our reaction to it is it gave investors more pause in thinking about there actually could be some bringing us back toward the baseline once we come out of hibernation. We knew we were going to go through some pain, but investors seem a little bit more confident that on the other side of this, things are going to go okay. But it's been a really long time since we've seen this kind of volatility in the markets. And if you go back to the last 2 recessions, which are the 2 shaded areas here, you can see the dot-com recession where we had a long slide of the S&P 500 down to its bottom sometime in early 2003. And then we slid again in the Great Recession down to 735, which is marked here in May 2009. We've been in an amazing bull market since. So while March was a very painful month in the market, investors are providing signals that investor confidence is somewhat back, which should at least suggest that things are going to go okay once we open the economy back up. The problem is we got to get there, and we're going through some pain in the process. That pain is going to show its face in labor markets. So here are 2 perspectives on unemployment insurance claims in the sense of the national and the state for California, and how much change has happened just in the last few weeks. So this is basically the number of claims on a weekly basis compounded up toward the total over a 4-week period. Here are the last 3 recessions to give you a perspective, and this is what's been happening since 1986. And you can see the last 3 recessions, where if I took the last 4 weeks out of this graph, the 3 recessions would look like a pretty big climb. But because they're so small versus what's happened in the last few weeks, the data now dominated just by those last 4 weeks in this whole long 34-year-long graph. So are we expecting a lot of people to become unemployed in April and May in terms of the data? Absolutely. This is California, also in perspective, same basic movement around the recessions, these little bumps that have been dwarfed by the latest data. So we're gonna see some real ugly data, but here's the key. Because this is happening so fast, we should have at least a shorter duration of the episode, assuming the policies that we've put in place work. And you can see here that this is unemployment insurance if you take that back down and flatten the numbers out to a 6-month average. So it gives you a sense of what was true around each of the 3 recessions we just looked at in California and what's been true, that spike on the far right-hand side. So we're going to be in for some tough time, and we should expect to have technical recession this year in terms of 2 quarters of negative GDP growth. Now, what have we tried to do to reduce the depth of the problem and reduce its duration? We've done 2 policies trying to combat a third. So here are the 3 policies. We have social policy, that's the negative, that has reduced our ability to have our normal economic lives. And just like in the Great Recession, we have combined a reduction of interest rates, which is monetary policy, and an increase in the amount of spending by our government, the so-called fiscal stimulus package, which is very wide and deep in terms of what it's trying to cover, as so-called fiscal policy. So those 2 are positives against the negative. And the idea is until our economy comes out of this current shelter in place and slowly rolls out towards something that looks like a normal economic life, we won't see the full fruition of these 2 positive policies against the negative. But in theory, once we get back to our normal lives, the spending we're doing right now in the lower interest rate environment should allow the sum of those 2 parts to eclipse the negative of the social policy. The trick is, how long is it going to take? Well, some of the fiscal measures are meant to provide this bridge over troubled water in the next few months and potentially the next few quarters. First, through an expansion of unemployment insurance and also just writing checks to people at home. So we're expecting those checks to all start slowly showing up over the next couple of months in earnest, in the combination of both the direct subsidy check and the unemployment insurance as people are laid off from their jobs. One of the trickiest things, if you're a business in Benicia, you got to be thinking about, how am I going to rehire people who may be paid more now for being out of work than what I've been paying them? So one of the things we're concerned about as economists is, while we may have a relatively easy opening in terms of people being excited and wanting to spend money, you may find that getting people to come back to work, where you see demand rising and you want to sort of get back to square, it might be tricky to get people back quickly, especially in lower to medium level wages. We've heard a lot about these business loans, so-called PPP, that are coming out of SBA. We've had 2 tranches, if you will, sort of 2 big blocks of money that have come out of the federal government and moved through our banks toward our businesses to keep them from letting anybody go from their job. We will see if there's a 3rd tranche, but if you talk to your local banker or your local credit union, they will tell you it's been absolutely crazy on the demand side. So many people want these loans because there's the possibility of them converting into a grant, which is like a huge tax refund. So we will see if all that plays out. But if you get one of these loans, be very certain to talk to your banker and know the exact criteria you have to match to convert that loan into a grant, if that's the goal of why you pursued the PPP loan in the first place. There's also hundreds of billions coming to the public sector, and as that slowly trickles through our states, down to our counties and cities, into an array of public sector entities, we might find that all it's really doing is basically filling partially the hole that's been left by this crisis. We should expect a lot more demand in terms of public services as well over the next few months and maybe quarters, because if people are out of work for a relatively long duration of time, especially those that may not have health insurance, we might see our social assistance and our healthcare systems pinched in different ways, where the COVID-19 did not change the demand that much, maybe in your area and specifically in Benicia. But what might happen is we might see an uptick in people who now need healthcare that weren't coming because they had health insurance and they lost it. We will see how that goes. One example of this is what's called the Employee Retention Tax Credit. And it's part of the just gigantic block of money that's going out called the CARES Act. And this is something that if you are a business, you might be eligible for a tax credit and actually a reduction of what you have to pay in taxes if you meet the criteria below, meaning that you had suspended operations due to what happened, and you had a 50% reduction in your gross receipts. We'll see how that evolves and how many businesses try to take advantage of that next tax season. But that's just one example of many, as well as the things above in terms of unemployment insurance and the PPP lending. That's part of this huge package coming out as fiscal policy. One of the biggest questions the city of Benicia is going to wrestle with, as every other municipality in California and in the United States is going to wrestle with over the next few days if they're not open, or the next few weeks, is the cost and benefits of making that decision. So on the cost side, the short-term costs, if you open, or if you reopen too early, for example, and you're going to have this either way, is the risk of reinfection. So as you reopen, and this is why our governor is being very cautious in terms of giving a schedule and thinking about what should happen first. We don't want reinfection. And if we have reinfection, we should expect some people to get sick. If it happens in such a way that then basically brings all the bads we were trying to avoid by shelter in place, we might have to shelter in place again. And that's the medium-term risk, or the cost that we face if we reopen and we don't do it right. And in the long term, what we don't want to do is we don't want to change what we think of as the productive capacity of our cities and counties. So if you think about the city of Benicia, the last thing you want to do is reopen in a way that puts more businesses and more jobs at risk, that while the short term, 2 or 3 months, might look pretty good. If you have too many reinfections, or the state feels like that by reopening too early, some places change the dynamics of the disease, that we have to go back to a statewide shelter in place, that can lead to another round of job and business losses that we don't want. And we don't want to change the structure of our economy any more than is necessary through this crisis. Of course, the lure of opening as soon as possible are the benefits. In the short term, we want to get our jobs and our revenues moving back toward our workers and our businesses. As municipalities, we want to see the tax revenue start coming back in. In the medium term, we're maybe making a bet that we're not going to have a repeat of the virus, or that we're going to be able to handle it in a way that's better than just shelter in place. However, we have to be thinking that there's a relatively good risk that we're going to have a repeat of this episode, either because we reinfected ourselves, we haven't not got so-called herd immunity yet, or that a second round of this comes back as the cases in this round dissipate and we get back toward flu season. However, this is the positive piece. In the long term, the benefits, which are really cool, is we might see some entrepreneurism that can lead to more adaptation by businesses in the way that they run their business to minimize the risk to their customers and their workers. And second, we may see some innovations that lead to new businesses, manufacturing, services, you name it, because we now have this new thing we have to contend with. The trick is whether or not businesses can handle the new costs, and that's really the key. Benefits always come with costs. It's classic in economics, and that's what a lot of cities and counties right now are wrestling with. What is the best way of rolling out to minimize the cost and try to gain access to some of those benefits we know are latent and just waiting there for us? Two words that are going to come up a lot over the next couple of quarters are the depth and duration. We want to lower the depth, meaning that we don't want it to be too deep, and we want to shorten the duration. We don't want it to take too long to get back to what we think of as a so-called baseline scenario. Well, in Northern California, we have a lot of recent events that maybe provide some perspective. So one way to think about this is think about this as a general natural disaster, meaning that instead of it being a fire, like in the refinery that happened last year, if you think about that refinery fire, that was pretty devastating for a few days and turned the corner right in Contra Costa County. If you think about what happened, the fires in Sonoma County or in Butte County, those were more devastating and lasted longer in terms of the recovery period. And in Butte County, they're still recovering from 2018. Where are we on this map? Well, one could make a hypothesis that we're basically about here, meaning that we're still in the short-term effects. You're going to hear a lot of hypotheses about a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, a modified V recovery. It's all the same talk we heard as we were going into the Great Recession 10 years ago. What we want to think about coming out of it, about 12 years ago when we started, we're going to have to go through all these stages to actually get to the end of this thing. The hope is that the two policies, fiscal and monetary, plus our own reversal of the social policy, happens in a way that they start to feed off of each other positively, and we shrink the time period, and those hills get smaller in terms of magnitude. That's what we're shooting for. But like I said earlier, we know we're going to see some pain in terms of the labor market. So what should we be thinking about in terms of labor? Well, if you look at past recessions, this is the US and California unemployment rates on a monthly basis from 1976 forward. So about 44 years worth of data. There's 5 recessions in these data, and you can see unemployment, which totally makes sense. It doesn't take an economist for you to figure this one out, that unemployment should rise during recession, peak, and then fall as we come out of recession. Why I'm showing you these data is it should give you a sense that if we're going towards something, and look at the far left-hand side in the axis where the percentages are. There's no percentage in the last 44 years that really goes above, let's say 11 for the US, and for California, it gets a little bit above 12. And this is, if you think about on the monthly data, this is as bad as it was. You can see some flat points where we were stuck at 12, especially after the Great Recession for a couple of months. But here's the point. We're probably going to hear something like 20% unemployment in California in the next few weeks. And that number is going to be shocking historically, but it's going to corroborate what we're seeing in these so-called new initial claims for unemployment insurance. So it allows us to use those data to predict what's happening. But this gives you the evolution in unemployment rates. And most people easily understand that when unemployment rates go up, bad times are happening. When they fall, good times are happening. But we do have a way of potentially predicting that. So check this out. Those are the last couple recessions, and this is where we've been just in March. You can see these little nubs headed up to tell us where we're going, which is not a good place for the time being. Here's California in terms of the unemployment insurance claims and the unemployment rate combined to give you that perspective of how one might dictate the other. There's the unemployment rate. This is from 1987 forward because the claims data only really go back that far. And here is the unemployment insurance claims, meaning that this is when people are going into EDD and saying, I am now going to be unemployed and I want my unemployment insurance. As that black line moves up, the number of unemployed slowly rise to its peak, because even when the black line peaks and starts to fall down, there's still positive growth of the number of people unemployed. It's really noticed that when the peak hits on the blue line is when the black line has gotten back down to basically less change or about the same change as it was 12 months ago, in such a way there's really no new unemployed people, and hence we top off and start to fall as we have no new claimants and people get jobs again. So in California, historically, it's taken about 20 months to get from one peak to the other. So if we have this sort of very rocket ship ride up in terms of claims, we may get to that peak a little sooner in California if we peak on these claims in the next few weeks. And some economists are predicting, based on the US weekly data, that exactly might happen. So that might mean that we're only in this for about 12 or 16 months in terms of off away from where we thought we were going to be. And by the end of 2021, we're back basically where we thought we'd be anyway, which means that hopefully 5-10 years from now, this will be a very hard memory. And I know it's hard to believe that somebody's even saying 5 or 10 years from now, because you're probably living 5 or 10 days maximum in the distance. But think of that perspective. We've been through this before. Don't panic. There's recessions, just to give you some perspective on those peaks. And now let's look at Solano County. So we don't have very good data at the city level, but Solano County, it's about 7 months from peak to peak. But that's because at the county level, things tend to ride out a little bit longer. So the duration of unemployment tends to be a little longer at the county level, especially ones that have more of a rural and suburban mix, like Solano County. But the city of Benicia happens to be kind of a light in terms of Solano County. It's really one of its stalwart cities and one of the drivers of the economic outcomes that you see at the county level because of its affluence and because of its connection to the Bay Area. So for Benicia, this is probably even shorter duration in terms of its residents being unemployed. And you can see there's the Great Recession in perspective, because these data only go from 2002 forward, so just that one case. Okay, but even though Benicia had a strong momentum coming into this and also should be at least turning the corner better than some of the other cities in Solano County and perhaps in the Bay Area, there's still vulnerabilities. We know there's been businesses that have been open and are so-called essential businesses, but we should assume that their demand levels are lower than normal, even for your local grocer who may have seen a quick uptick. Those upticks are going to start to fade over time. And when we open our economy back up, there's going to be demand shifts again. So there's really no business out there that's not vulnerable. So it puts a lot of demand on our economic development professionals. So folks like Mario get their hands full when this thing opens up and just trying to figure out where the opportunities are. We know our travel businesses and our hotels are going to have a lot of problems. So restaurants and retail that are dependent upon the movement of people are going to be they're going to have serious problems over the next few quarters, especially if we don't roll this out very soon. We're going to eat up some of that natural tourism time in California, and a lot of these businesses are going to be a threat for this entire year. And what we're trying to avoid, folks, is this sort of domino effect from job loss to business loss to more job loss, because demand starts to go away as more and more businesses go away, that then might lead to housing problems. And I'll come back and talk about that sequence in just a minute. Healthcare has a mixed bag of effects. We've had positive gains in healthcare because there's been a lot of money that's poured in to help if healthcare spikes or healthcare demand spikes due to COVID-19. But because we've been so good at shelter in place, that demand has not really shown up at the same level we expected. So all the other parts of the medical system that we've delayed because of shelter in place have lost demand and lost revenue. So we're hoping that once we open up, one of the first things that opens up is the other parts of our healthcare system that can run parallel to potential new cases and get back to business. Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to start losing our medical professionals, have to scramble around and find those folks again once we get back to more of a normal economy. Our governments are going to be definitely vulnerable in the sense that we're expecting revenues to go down and expenses to go up. Those are two things any organization does not want to see happen simultaneously if you can help it, but we should expect that. We know revenues have gone down because the economic activity has gone down, and because there's going to be more people unemployed, more people struggling just to make ends meet, social assistance demand is going to rise as well. And our workers that are low wage and commuters are really the most vulnerable on the non-business side. So we got to think about, in City of Benicia, we're going to have some folks that are, you know, maybe marginally homeless, marginally in their cars, just like every other community in California. What are we going to do for those folks? Because the unemployment insurance, if you're getting it, our undocumented workers may not be getting it in some or most cases. It doesn't solve hunger and rent if you have to get those things done and just try to eat. So we're watching that very closely to see how long people are out of work and in what industries seem to shed the most jobs to really focus our energy with respect to economic development. Just to wrap up on the municipal side, we expect taxable sales to fall. That's already happening, and a lot of cities and counties are scrambling about how they're going to deal with that, especially on the TOT side, which tend to be a lot more focal locally. Will construction slow down? This is one of the biggest question marks out there, and this is also one of the biggest ways in which cities and counties can help come around once we open back up and help developers move projects forward to get people working in construction again. But if we don't have very good demand forecasts going forward, we might see some sag in the amount of construction that's happening because we just don't have the return on investment for developers to advertise as this is why you should build more housing units or more commercial space. If that happens and we see prices start to fall a little bit, we might have another property tax shock. A lot of economists are kind of mixed about what's going to happen with housing prices, so we may not have this, but we should be planning slightly forward. That's why I say watching for it. It's not explicit it's going to happen yet. I said this earlier, cost of social assistance is going to rise. We should expect more public safety issues, especially the longer this lingers, but really more social assistance demand once the economy opens back up. And if you are a public worker and you're thinking about retiring, this crisis may in fact push you over the edge. So we should expect that our labor force on the public side that can provide a lot of the social assistance may be thinking about going into retirement. And our retirement systems are going to have a lot of pressure on them because of lower stock market returns this year, probably one way or the other. Being very intriguing to see if the S&P 500 gets back to where it started this year. But furthermore, just thinking about the increase in liabilities if people start retiring. Because Benicia has some touch on the oil markets, I wanted to show you these two graphs. The red line is what we think of as West Texas Intermediate crude in the United States. We watch this as sort of a way of thinking about the gasoline price at the pump, and you can see the blue line is the gasoline price in an indexed way, and you can see how closely related these are. So when you hear about the barrel price of oil, it tells you something about the gas price at the pump. But further, the petroleum industry in Benicia is somewhere in the middle of the supply chain, so it should have kind of more of a mixed bag of effects in terms of the manufacturing standpoint in the city. But watching the oil price has been a really wacky ride, and this year's had that sort of parallel news line going on. But we should expect, especially once the economy opens back up, to see some positive demand pressure on these prices. The supply side of the market is just going crazy because they have political issues, they don't know what the demand forecast is, and they don't want to shut off everything for fear of not being able to quickly turn it back on. So there's a lot of question marks in terms of how prices are going to go over the next couple of months. And you can see that's how wild the ride's been recently. So to start wrapping up, what I want to do is I want to show you scenarios for the state of California that the Department of Finance and I have both been working on. I'm on this team with the California Department of Finance to do their annual forecast for the state of California. And I'm going to show you a baseline in a minute, but the first one's the tricky scenario. So if this doesn't end before, let's say, the 1st of June, it's very likely that we will see a dip in jobs that is relatively dramatic. But if it does end and we have a relatively good coming out party, we might be able to get back in 2021 to more or less the original baseline forecast, meaning that we don't have a repeat or we've mitigated the costs of a potential repeat. And it's still tricky because we've got to get around that potential repeat scenario without a vaccine. But if we do so in a good fashion, we probably be back to square by the end of next year. The ugly scenario is a repeat of the infection, and it's going to look like a double dip on the graph, which I'll show you in a minute. And when that double dip hits, it means more job loss, more potential business loss, and an elongation of the duration of the episode, which is what we're trying to avoid. So these are the two scenarios we're looking at. We know we're going to go through some pain. I try to describe that above. Hopefully it made sense what we're going to see in terms of job losses. But here's one way of thinking about those job losses in California. Those are the last couple recessions. These data are from 2000 forward on a quarterly basis. And the black line is the baseline forecast and the actual. So if you look at where 2020 started in January, and I'll outline this area in just a minute, that going forward is the forecast. Now, here's the good scenario that I originally had. I didn't take it off here because I wanted to just say that at one time I thought this was possible, but I don't think that anymore. I think this is more likely the tricky scenario, which is in the blue, and the red is the ugly. So for California, the ugly scenario, notice it has that double dip, and hopefully you're going to see my little arrow here as it comes over to the graph to point this out. This double dip suggests that we will come out after a lot of pain and start to climb back up, but that we'll get reinfected as a society in such a way that we might have to shelter in place again, and it will keep us from recovering. So it won't lead to a real hard second hit. It will just elongate the hit and not allow us to kind of get back on that elevated movement back up toward the black line, the baseline, and then up we go. So the tricky one, which is the blue, has us basically getting back to baseline by the end of 2021, early 2022, and it'll take till the end of 2023 to get through the ugly scenario, which basically means 3 lost years because of this. Furthermore, if we have the ugly scenario, this is the Great Recession in historic perspective, but we will go back to basically 2015 levels of jobs in California, which means we'll lose really about almost 8 years of jobs growth to get back to where we wanted to be. And that's a pretty tough situation. It's somewhat similar to what happened in the Great Recession. And you can see that oval shaded area is where the baseline started to give you a sense of where the forecast began. So those areas with the forecast or with the scenarios is the forecasted area for right now. Okay. Now, all that might sound relatively negative, but there are some potential opportunities, and the opportunities do exist for Benicia. So one is to think about what the municipality can do. It can facilitate and assist. It can be cautious about saying that it should provide direct payments. It's going to have its own budget problems, just like the county of Solano, just like the state of California. So direct payments are unlikely from most municipalities just simply because of the budget fluctuations and some risk that exists inside of those budgets. But by facilitating and assisting, try to put all the resources together possible to help businesses turn the corner and to try to keep people in their jobs. The social assistance demand is coming. Cities and counties are going to have a lot of things they're going to do for people once we lift the shelter in place anyway, by the nature of the downturn in jobs. Pharmaceutical manufacturing. Pharmaceutical is a big part of Solano County's economy. It's possible Benicia can maybe enter this game a little bit, especially if there's federal subsidies around expanding pharmaceutical or the healthcare supply chain with respect to providing either more services to help healthcare or to actually making personal protection gear and stuff like that, where we're moving into a new phase of our economy where almost every single business is going to have to take on some social restrictions. You can find visitor opportunities as well, believe it or not. Once visitors want to move around, Benicia with the waterfront has a large opportunity to try to drive a little bit more action toward downtown and toward the waterfront. That's something to think about, where a lot of the movement on I-80 might not be there in the short term, but there'll be regional movements off of I-80 where people are not going long distances, but they want to access something different and get out of the house. This is especially true if air travel is not as easy to do, more costly, and or just more of a hassle with whatever you got to wear on the airplane. That might be a slower evolution. In terms of where Benicia was, and this is the key, one of the beauties of Benicia is that it entered this situation well. Better than some other cities that maybe are still feeling some of the lingering effects from the Great Recession that now have to deal with this. So Benicia is in a good place in terms of not only Solano County, but in terms of the Bay Area as a whole. Thinking forward, what should you be watching? I made a big deal about these initial claims for unemployment insurance. Well, the 4 weeks previous to last week, we had about 22 million people. Now we're about 26, and by the end of this week, we're probably going to be closer to 30 million people who have asked for unemployment insurance in the United States. And in California, we're probably north of 3 million people. That's a lot of people unemployed. But we knew this was coming by the nature of the way we took on the social policies. And what the monetary and fiscal policies are meant to do are to create incentives for more job openings, more actual people employed once we turn the corner and sort of get down to the bottom very quickly and start climbing back up, just like the scenarios I showed you, and see those average hours worked, which right now have declined for some industries, specifically hotel and restaurants, pick back up again. It's all about the cases, folks. So to fight the duration and depth episodes of long duration, deep recession, the policies are meant to work, but we have to get around this negative of the social policy first in trying to fight the cases rising. So we've traded off healthcare pinch and lost lives for lost economic opportunity on the front end. We will see if these policies work once the cases start to fall and we start to lift those social policies. And that's what we're really talking about right now. So no matter which way you look at it, there's still opportunity out there, and the planning phase is right now. The more that we can plan as a city, a county, and a state, the better off. But Benicia started in a really good place. And I see Benicia exiting this better than a lot of the cities in the, let's say, eastern part of the Bay Area and certainly in Solano County based on how it entered. So Mario, with that, I'll take questions that you have, and I want to thank you all again for having me tonight, and Chabin for being a partner on this.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And for those, this is your first opportunity to see Dr. Eyler. He is participating in webinars, typically on Friday. Dr. Eyler, when's your next one that you're participating with Chabin Concepts?
I think it's May 7. But okay. But Chabin has that information. So if you go to the website there, Chabin will have that webinar information.
So for those of you really interested in this type of information, Dr. Eyler has already done this presentation or updated this presentation a couple of times. So go to chabinconcepts.com and you can register for the future webinars in the morning. Certainly in economic development, we're going to do what we can to provide updates to our community. Right now, if you have any questions, we do have a couple of minutes, so feel free to type them in the chat message, and we'll ask those of Dr. Eyler where we have them for we can probably do a few questions.
Yes.
So it's quiet right now, so we'll see. I'm going to verbally note we did have a question from Councilmember Young. He was inquiring about the number of Solano County unemployment numbers. Since March 1st, Solano County has had a total of 29,302 uninsurance claims, unemployment insurance claims. And Dr. Eyler, you were right with California. The total number is 3.2 million, almost 3.3.
Yep.
There was a question, or at least a comment, related to reopening. That's really in the role of the state of California, and then the various counties making those decisions, and then the cities are following suit.
Yep.
So we have a question from our library director, David Dodd. Do we have a sense of how many Benicia businesses have received PPP funding? And for those of you not familiar with that acronym, that's the Paycheck Protection Program. This is the program the feds have now funded twice. We don't have that number. I've heard anecdotally from a variety of businesses that have struggled getting processed. The second wave of funding hit the banks yesterday. So I'm optimistic that we can have more Benicia businesses funded. I'm only aware of 2 that have contacted me that I know that have been approved. So if you have been approved and you're a business, contact our office and let us know. That'd be good information for us to track.
Yeah, but it's very critical, Mario. I want to say this again. I said this very quickly earlier, that if you do gain access to the PPP loan, be sure to recognize that it starts as a loan and converts to a grant only if you satisfy the criteria to convert it to a grant. So if you're concerned about having interest payments on the other side, and you're also concerned about making good on those criteria, be careful that you're adding to your debt load. Please be sure to talk to your banker about what you need to do to convert that into a grant. Don't assume that by keeping all your employees, that's all you have to do. Just make sure that you've got that nailed, even if it seems very simple.
That's a great point, and that was actually one of the feedback, or a couple of feedbacks from the businesses that have been approved. They said it was difficult getting processed, but there's a whole heck of a lot of work just going through making sure to convert that loan into a grant. We have a question on, do you foresee small businesses getting impacted with higher unemployment rates long term?
So I'm concerned I don't understand the question very well, but if one of the points behind that question is that the high unemployment rate means that there's going to be lower demand and that businesses are going to be negatively affected by that, the answer is absolutely. The trick is whether or not we can turn the corner well in such a way to try to get as many people back to work as possible. The one thing that's nice in theory about the heightened unemployment insurance benefits is it might provide more demand that than would have been there under the normal unemployment insurance levels for a longer duration of time. But you should not bank, let's say, a short-term business plan on the idea that if there's 20% unemployment, but people are still getting, they're getting more money anyway, that they'll just keep on spending and I'll be okay. When those insurance benefits end, that's when there's going to be a lot of trickery unless we get these people rehired. And so it's better for our economy that while people may be getting more or higher unemployment benefits, it's better for them to be rehired for the productive capacity of our economy, medium to long term. So there are some problems no matter what in the short term for businesses.
We just had a comment touching upon that point, Dr. Eyler, about the conflict with employees receiving unemployment benefits from the state and feds that are more lucrative than going back to work, and the conflict that those policies are having with employers.
Absolutely, and it's been intriguing to watch. There's not been an enormous amount of discussion about this yet in, let's say, labor and public economic circles, because that's really where the friction's happening. In the public economic side said, we need to give people help. The labor economic side says, if you give them too much help, it makes it harder for me to rehire, because they have an incentive to not take a job unless the wage and the total cash compensation exceeds what I would be getting in total cash compensation by staying at home. Unfortunately, where the pinch might happen is on health insurance. So if people are on unemployment but do not have same access to the health that they had at their job, that might tip them over. Again, part of that total cash compensation and the way that we really look at the totality of our work life. So we'll see, though. In low wage jobs, there's going to be a lot of pressure.
I have a question on housing. How big a factor will the housing shortage be on the economy?
Well, it depends on your perspective, but if you're worried about housing prices going down rapidly in kind of a dubious, ironic way, the housing shortage might help preserve your housing wealth in the short term, because there's not going to be an enormous number of units that are just readily available to where you'd put more pressure on housing prices on the supply side. However, the longer the duration of unemployment, the more pressure there's going to be on people that are currently in their homes to think very deeply about whether or not the job opportunities are going to be here, and really it's the income opportunities overall, to stay in the home and want to put their house up for sale and see what happens, given the demand side of the housing market looks pretty good with respect to interest rates. And if income turns and looks a little bit better in terms of going toward the next couple of years, people might want to take advantage of the low interest rates while they're in play. And so there may be demand support, even if some existing units go up. But it would, in kind of the positive light, if you're looking at housing shortage, if existing units go up, it should relieve some of the current price pressure. It's a really wild matrix right now. We don't have any idea. Anybody tells you they know what's going to happen in the housing market, they're totally crazy. They have no idea what's going to happen. But what seems at least likely is if we exit this situation relatively well and get moving in our economy again, the supply and demand conditions in housing should get back to some regularity soon, rather than, let's say, have a Great Recession round 2. But that Great Recession round 2 will definitely happen if we lose a lot of workers for a long period of time and businesses start to fail as a result of that locally and regionally. So assume that those are the triggers. We need positive movement back toward that baseline to not put any more pressure on our housing markets.
We'll do a couple more questions. One, do you have any thought on how this will impact the future of brick and mortar retail stores as compared to online shopping?
What a great question. I really think, unfortunately, that this could be the death knell for a lot of our classic downtown mom and pop merchants for two reasons. One, if you're already on slim margins, this situation is not helping by a long shot. Second, places like Amazon are going to try to take advantage of this. As philanthropic as those businesses may sound on the surface, they are looking to absorb more and more market share and utilize technology to deliver goods to home. That's where they make all the juice, is by adding more subscribers and engaging more people in shopping online. So they're going to take full advantage of the situation if they can. From crisis comes opportunity. for our mom and pop sort of brick and mortar retail and our malls, there's now even more pressure for those merchants to stay in business. So this could speed the unfortunate demise of a lot of our sort of classic merchants that we know and have seen for decades in Benicia and all around the Bay Area. But in some cases, unfortunately, it was just going to be one episode like this that was going to ultimately dictate that fate.
Here's a question. If you were advising the governor in developing the phasing plan to reopen our economy, would it be safer and would we better avoid the double dip if businesses were open slowly by industry or by employment level?
Wow, what a great question. What a great twist at the end. Probably more by industry, because the industries tend to have more uniform types of business in the sense that one business looks like the other. Like, let's take construction. Most construction sites have a very similar look and feel if they are doing specific types of construction. So you could say, okay, if you're doing exterior framing, here's what you got to do. If you're doing heavy construction and doing highway repair and or building, here's what you got to do to stay safe. And so under the idea that you're going to be able to pull that off, we're going to go ahead and open those back up in full. Now, of course, Solano County hasn't really changed in terms of construction thus far, but for the other parts of California, that could be one way of looking at it. Restaurants is like the polar example, or any place we gather. We don't have a clue what restrictions might come to those types of businesses, and that's something, once we have that certainty, the cool thing is we can plan for it. So I think it's going to be more at the industry level, because if you think about it, close your eyes and say, okay, what's a restaurant normally look like? It has a certain look and feel, which means if you open it by industry, you can sort of dictate, here are the terms, we're going to open in 3 weeks, start your planning now, which hopefully you're already doing, and get ready to go. And that allows the restaurant industry, which has a very similar feel from one to the other, to plan as an industry. So it's better to do it by industry than, let's say, size of employer, because the size of employer might have 3 or 4 of them that have completely distinct business models, but just happen to be relatively large in the area. So it should roll out by industry rather than size of business in terms of employment.
Well, Dr. Eyler, thank you so much for spending the time this evening to go over those graphs and that information with our community. And for those of you still on the call, please keep checking in on BeniciaBusiness.com for information and updates regarding our business resources. And for those of you that haven't already, please sign up for our City Manager, Lori Tinfo's Benicia This Week. We constantly have updates on city policy and information that comes out from our city manager's office. And so for everyone joining tonight, thank you so much. You now have the responsibility to share some of this information with your colleagues and business partners and neighbors. And we wish you all the best during this COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thanks, Mario. And anybody on the chat who didn't get their question answered, get my information and let me know by email or by Twitter, and I'll take care of you. Thank you.